The third interview of Dr. Jamisson Neruda. By Sarah.
What follows is a session I recorded of Dr. Neruda on December 30, 1997. He gave permission for me to record his answers to my questions. This is the transcript of that session. This was one of 5 times I was able to tape record our conversations. I have preserved these transcripts precisely as they occurred. No editing was performed, and I've tried my best to include the exact words, phrasing, and grammar used by Dr. Neruda. It's recommended that you read the December 27 and December 28, 1997 interviews before reading this one. Good evening, Dr. Neruda. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready when you are.
One of the things that I find hard to embrace about this whole affair is that the concept of time travel always seemed like a fairly easy technology to develop. I know I've gotten that impression from Star Trek and various other movies and television, but still, what you've described seems like it's so difficult to develop that we'll never succeed. Is it really that hard to develop?
The way time travel is presented in the movies trivializes the complexities of this technology, and interactive time travel or BST, as defined by 15, is the most sophisticated of all technologies. It's the apex technology from which virtually all other technologies can be derived. So, in creating BST, one is creating a shortcut or an accelerated pathway into the acquisition of virtually all other technologies. This is why BST is so difficult to develop. Science fiction violates most of the scientific premises that are related to our understanding of time travel. And BST in particular is an extremely sophisticated application of scientific principles that are simply not stated in science fiction, mostly because people like the effects and plot lines of time travel, more than they have an appetite for understanding the science behind it. So writers, especially for television and movies, trivialize the degree of complexity that surrounds this apex technology.
But you didn't really answer my question. Will we succeed in developing it?
There's little doubt in my mind that the Labyrinth Group will succeed in developing BST. The question is, whether it's in humanity's best interest in the long term. They were weeks from beginning their initial tests for broad-scale testing just before I defected. There was widespread anticipation at the director level that BST was a matter of 4 to 6 months away from a successful test.
So what's the biggest obstacle to success?
Simply stated, it's whether the Labyrinth Group has the ability to define and access intervention points as prescribed by 15 that have the least impact on related events in horizontal time. It's the most subtle, yet most important component to this whole chain of technologies.
Can you explain this in lay terms?
It's an extremely difficult technology to develop. Defining the optimal intervention point, accessing the intervention point, and returning from the intervention point, without detection. This is all about splicing time at the causal level with a minimum of disruption. It's the equivalent challenge of throwing a boulder into a pond without any ripples.
Why all the concern about minimizing disruption? I mean, in the case of the Animus, aren't they trying to completely annihilate humankind? Why should we care so much about disrupting their way of life?
First of all, the Animus are not coming to annihilate humankind. They're coming to control the genetic library, known as Earth. Their intention is not completely understood, but it's not to kill our animal populations or the human species. It has more to do with genetic engineering and how their species can be modified to enable it to house a spiritual consciousness. They want unfettered access to our DNA in order to conduct experiments. Beyond this, they want to colonize Earth, but for what ultimate purpose, we don't know. To your question, the concern about minimizing impacts from BST intervention has to do as much with selfish interests as altruistic ones. When events are altered or changed, they can have unintended and very unpredictable consequences. For example, we could successfully divert the Animus from our galaxy, but in the process, unintentionally send them to another planet. This act would have consequences to our planet that we could never predict.
Are you talking about karma?
No. It has to do with physics and the inherent nature of complex systems. Causal energy is eternal. It simply bounces from event to event. In some cases, it shapes the event, in others, it creates the event. Causal energy is the most potent force in the universe, and when it's redirected on a global scale it will rebound in unpredictable and innumerable ways.
So, this is the flaw of BST. not knowing the consequences of changing events? Are you suggesting that we could succeed in diverting the animus from our planet, and then some years later fall victim to some other form of catastrophe that wipes out our planet?
No, it doesn't happen quite like that. The energy system that was redirected would simply rebound to the point from whence it was redirected. How it would rebound is so complex that it would be impossible to predict the nature of its reaction. I suppose it could invite a cataclysm of some kind, but it's not to say humanity would be punished, if that's what you're trying to imply.
I guess that's what I was implying. But isn't it true that karma exists? And if we turned the animus onto another planet via BST, we'd be setting ourselves up for a negative reaction?
No. It means we'd receive a reaction, and the nature of the reaction may be so unrelated to the causal energy redirect that no one would know it was a reaction. This is the nature of causal energy. It rebounds of its own force and intelligence. It's not a simple reaction to an action.
I thought karma, and even physics, held that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. What happened to this principle?
It's alive and well. It just doesn't apply to causal energy systems or the dimension of vertical time.
Okay, I'm going to avoid another discussion of physics in favor of finding out why you think BST will succeed given our discussion of the past few minutes.
It's one of the main reasons I defected.
How do you mean that?
This issue of uncertainty, regarding causal energy systems, has always been the breaking point of BST, at least theoretically. 15 believes he knows how to manage this. I'm not so certain it can be managed, particularly after my exposure to the Wingmakers and gaining a bit of understanding into their solution in dealing with the animus.
I know you've talked a little bit about this already, but refresh my memory. What is their solution?
I have only a few pieces to go by, so I'm not going to be able to talk definitively about this.
And what's the nature of these sources?
There was an RV session that elicited some insight. I read more about it in the introduction of the text from the optical disc.
This being the text that literally disappeared.
Yes, but I've stored the entire text in my memory.
Anything else?
I had a direct communication with what I believe was a representative of the Wingmakers.
How? When?
It's a complicated story, but Samantha, the RV assigned to our project, was having increasingly strong connections to the Wingmakers. Unfortunately, they were so strong that 15 had little choice but to subject her to an MRP. I met with her just prior to the procedure, and she suddenly began channeling a presence to me that I believe was from the central race.
And from these three sources you have a pretty good idea as to how the Wingmakers plan to protect their genetic library?
Correct.
And what did this channeled entity say?
Its primary emphasis was that our technology would fail us.
And by technology, it meant BST?
That was my interpretation.
So you trust this Samantha?
I have no doubts about her whatsoever. She was simply our best RV, and quite possibly the best natural intuitive we ever had within the ACO.
Let's go back to something you implied a minute ago. Did I understand you right that you defected from the ACO because of a disagreement you had with 15 about BST and the Wingmakers' solution of defense?
Yes. It was a primary factor.
Can you elaborate on this a bit?
15 believed that Samantha, our RV, could jeopardize our mission because of her ability to make contact with the Wingmakers. In 2 of the 3 RV sessions she performed, they detected her presence, and they had begun to probe her. 15, once he had confirmation that these beings were, in all probability, from the central race, became quite alarmed and put a stop to any further RV sessions. When I asked him why, he seemed to have some apprehension about their ability to sense our work on BST, and feared that they may put an end to it.
Why?
Because they are very powerful beings. What most people consider God, amplify by a factor of 1,000 and you would be close to the range of capabilities and power that these beings can wield.
Are you saying these beings are more powerful than God?
The problem with your question is that I don't know which God you're referring to. The conception of God in the Bible, or most of our planet's holy books, bears no resemblance to the image of God that I hold in my mind.
Okay, I want to come back to this topic because it really holds an interest to me, but I also want to complete our discussion around your defection. Can you explain what happened?
Simply put, I began to feel that the defensive weapon installed on this planet by the Wingmakers stood a better chance of succeeding than BST. All logic dictated this to be true. 15, however, disagreed. He would allow further investigation into how to find the remaining Wingmakers sites and how to bring them online, but he would never share the technology or anything related to the discovery with the general public.
And so your differences over this issue caused your defection?
Yes.
Back to the topic of God. Tell me how your version of God is defined.
God is a unifying force, primal and eternal. This force is the original force that summoned life from itself to become both its companion and journey. The life that was summoned was experimented with many times until a soul carrier was formed that could take a particle of this force into the outer, expanding universes.
I assume this soul carrier you're referring to is the central race?
Correct.
Are these the same as angels?
No, the central race is more akin to genetic planners and universe architects. They're not well known or understood, even in the most insightful cosmologies held by the core team.
So, I presume if angels are real, they're yet another creation of the central race?
Correct.
Then God, or this force as you were describing it, didn't really create anything other than the central race, and then return to his abode in the center of the universe? It sounds like the central race does all the work.
The central race is simply a time-shifted version of the human race.
Huh?
The central race holds the genetic archetype of the human species, no matter what form it takes on, no matter what time it lives in, no matter what part of the universe it lives in. This archetype is like a magnetic force, it draws the lesser developed versions of the species towards it. All versions of the humanoid species are merely time-shifted versions of the central race, or at least that's the view of the core team.
Stop a second. Are you saying that I'm made from the same DNA as the central race? That I'm essentially the same, genetically speaking, just in a different time and space? How's that possible?
It's possible because the central race designed it that way. DNA is not something that only transmits physical characteristics or predispositions. It transmits our concepts of time, space, energy, and matter. It transmits our conscious and unconscious filters. It transmits our receptivity to the inward impulse of original thought, and this receptivity is what defines the motion of the being.
The motion of the being?
All beings are in motion. They're going somewhere every moment of their lives. If not physically in motion, their minds are in motion. Their subconscious is always in motion, interacting with the data stream of a multiverse. The motion of the being is simply a term we used at the ACO to define the internal compass.
And the internal compass is?
It's the radar system of the individual that defines its path through life at both their macroscopic and microscopic levels, and everywhere in between.
I have this feeling that this topic could go on forever.
It's not that complex, Sarah. Think of the decisions you make in your life. Which ones would you say were made for you by external sources, which ones were your own, and which ones were a combination of both external and your own decision?
You mean as a percentage?
Try to estimate.
It depends on what stage of my life I consider. When I was a baby, my parents made all my decisions.
No, this applies to all stages from birth to death. Just make a guess.
I don't know, maybe 40% external, 30% my own, and 30% a combination.
Then you'd be surprised if I told you that you deposit an image within your DNA before you're born that defines your motion of being. And when this deposit is made, your motion of being is defined by you, not someone else. No external force makes your decision, an external force can only inform and activate a decision already made.
You lost me. Are you saying that every decision in my life was already made before I was born?
No. Every causal decision was.
So what's the difference between a causal decision and a regular decision?
Think of how many decisions you make in a day. Wouldn't you agree that it's probably hundreds if not thousands every day? These are, as you put it, regular decisions. Causal decisions are defined by how integral they are to the substrate of the individual being. Are you receptive to new ideas? Are you able to synthesize opposing thoughts? Do you process information dominantly in a visual or numeric context? These are causal decisions that you define before being born, and they're encoded within the DNA that activates your decision matrix. External forces like parents, teachers, and friends only inform you of what you've already defined as the motion of your being.
Is this according to the core TM, too?
This is part of the learning I personally gathered from my LOM experiences. The core team subscribe to a similar belief, however.
You're telling me a variation of reincarnation, aren't you? When you said that we deposit an image within our DNA before we're born, who exactly does the depositing?
Only the formless consciousness can deposit an image onto the DNA template.
I assume you're talking about soul?
It depends again on your definition of soul. The formless consciousness is that which observes and experiences through forms or structures, not just physical embodiments. For example, consciousness can be contained inside a structure or form, but not be physically based. The mind is such a structure. While it's not physical, consciousness, when physically embodied, peers through a mind structure like someone looking through a window. Soul is often confused with the mind and vice versa. The formless consciousness is that particle of God that is decelerated from the frequency of the God state, into individuality, where it can become autonomous and exercise free will. Think of it like a photon, or subatomic particle that is cast into a web of interconnected particles of like-mindedness. That is to say, all the particles have a similar frequency, or spin rate, and they're able to step down their frequency, at will, in order to enter membranes of consciousness that can only be entered by taking on a form. So the formless becomes form, and just before it enters the body, consciousness activates the DNA template according to its desired experiences within the membrane of reality it chooses.
What do you mean by the term membrane?
The multiverse is a collection of reality membranes, clustered together in a dimensional matrix that responds to the thought circuits and gravity fields of our formless consciousness. We've been trained, through evolutionary timescales, to accept the three-dimensional world as our reality. These reality membranes are not structured like parallel planes or rungs of a ladder, but rather are like lattices of interlocking cells. If you want, I can describe them in more detail, but I think it becomes so abstract from here forward that I suspect your eyes will glaze over.
All of this seems unbelievable. I'm beginning to wonder if you're the reincarnation of Jesus or Buddha.
I'm reincarnated, and that's as far as I can attest.
Do you remember any of your previous incarnations?
Previous is a relative term. I prefer to think of my incarnations not so much as a function of memory, but something more akin to a bleed-through of a simultaneous reality membrane. The compartments into which human experience is divided are not so watertight that they exclude one life from entering, or influencing, another. And from my experience, these compartments represent parallel moments in the life of an individual across a broad sweep of time and space.
So you're implying that our past, present, and future lives are all lived out at the same time, even though they seem to be taking place in different places and times?
Yes.
Okay, then explain how it's possible, because it doesn't make any sense to me.
Our formless consciousness is like a sphere with many, many spokes leading outwards from its central core. Each of these spokes connects into the vertical time continuum through forms, and these forms, human or otherwise, feed the formless consciousness with insights about the different reality membranes in which it has form. In this way, the forms of the formless bring it awareness of different reality membranes, which in turn is processed by the formless and passed on through the unification force to God.
God's the recipient of all this information or experience? From every living thing? From every time and place? How?
I don't have any idea.
But this is what you believe, and I have to assume you wouldn't believe it if you didn't have some evidence to support your belief.
Sometimes you follow a trail of evidence to a point where it comes to an abrupt end, but you can still imagine how the trail continues despite the lack of proof that it moves forward in a particular direction. You can intuit its pathway. Call it imagination or pure conjecture, I don't care. But it's what I've done in this case. I truly don't know how this magnitude of data could possibly be processed for any useful purpose, but I believe it.